Perhaps you have a piece of silver nearby right now. Maybe it's a coin resting in a drawer, or a spoon dulled soft by generations of use, or a ring passed down through your family. If you were to hold it, you'd feel its particular coolness against your skin, heavier than it looks, with that distinctive luster that seems to capture moonlight even in darkness. We rarely pause to consider where this quiet metal came from, how it shaped the rise and fall of empires, how it connected distant civilizations through threads of trade and desire. Tonight, we'll trace the long, winding journey of silver through human history. We'll travel back thousands of years, through ancient mines and medieval mints, following this companion to gold as it flowed across continents and transformed economies. There's no need to concentrate too hard. Let the story wash over you like a gentle stream. So settle in, let your breathing slow, and allow your mind to drift as we explore the sleepy history of silver. Silver has been with us for a very long time. Long before recorded history began, before cities rose and empires formed, humans discovered this lustrous metal and recognized something special in it. It gleamed with a soft, cool light quite different from gold's warm glow. It could be worked and shaped, hammered thin or drawn into wire, moulded into objects both beautiful and useful. And unlike iron or copper, it did not rust or tarnish quickly, maintaining its gentle shine across years and generations. The earliest evidence of silver working dates back perhaps 7,000 years to ancient Anatolia, that region we now call Turkey. Archaeological excavations have uncovered silver objects from sites dating to around 5,000 years before the Common Era. Small ornaments and ceremonial items that suggest silver was already valued, already set apart from common metals. But it was in the great river valleys of Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates, that silver first became something more than decoration. It became a measure of value, a standard by which other goods could be judged. In the city-states of ancient Sumer and later Babylon, silver served as a kind of proto-currency. The shekel, a word that would echo through millennia of monetary history, was first and foremost a unit of weight for silver. When a Babylonian merchant spoke of a price in shekels, they meant a specific weight of silver, typically about 8 1/3 grams. Contracts were written in silver, debts calculated in silver, wages sometimes paid in silver. The metal had become a common language of value, something that diverse peoples with different goods and different needs could agree upon. The silver used in Mesopotamia came from distant sources, probably from mines in Anatolia, and perhaps from as far as the mountains of what is now Afghanistan. This long-distance trade in silver was itself remarkable, suggesting networks of exchange that stretched across hundreds of miles, connecting cultures that otherwise had little contact. The merchants who carried silver along these routes were not just transporting metal, they were carrying trust, the shared belief that this particular substance held value wherever one travelled. But it was in the Greek world that silver first became truly central to both economy and power. The story centres on a range of hills southeast of Athens, a rocky, unassuming landscape called Laurium. Beneath those hills lay silver ore, and the discovery of rich deposits there in the 6th century before the Common Era would transform Athens from a modest city-state into a great power. The mines of Laurium were worked by thousands of labourers, many of them enslaved, who descended into narrow shafts and tunnels to extract the ore. The work was difficult and dangerous, carried out by lamplight in cramped spaces deep underground. The ore had us be brought to the surface, crushed, washed, and smelted to separate the silver from the surrounding rock. It was patient, grinding work, but the rewards were substantial. The silver that flowed from Laurium would fund the golden age of Athens, paying for the Parthenon and the other magnificent buildings that crowned the Acropolis, supporting the world's first democracy, and building the fleet that would defend Greece against Persian invasion. In 483 before the Common Era, the Athenians discovered a particularly rich vein of silver at Laurium. The windfall came at a crucial moment. Persia, the great empire to the east, had already attempted one invasion of Greece and been turned back at Marathon. Another invasion seemed inevitable. The Athenian statesman Themistocles convinced his fellow citizens to use the silver not for immediate distribution among themselves, as some proposed, but to build warships. The decision proved fateful. When the Persian king Xerxes invaded in 480, the Athenian navy, funded by Laurium silver, played a decisive role in the Greek victory at the sea battle of Salamis. The silver of Laurium also made possible one of the ancient world's most successful currencies. The Athenian tetradrachm, a silver coin weighing about 17 grams, became the international money of the Mediterranean and beyond. On one side, the coin bore the image of Athena, the city's patron goddess, helmeted and dignified. On the reverse was her sacred bird, the owl, along with an olive branch and the first letters of Athens' name. These Athenian owls, as they came to be known, circulated far beyond Athens itself. Merchants from Egypt to the Black Sea accepted them readily, trusting in their consistent weight and purity. Finding an Athenian owl in your purse meant holding money that would be recognized almost anywhere in the known world. The success of Athenian silver coinage was partly technical. The Athenians maintained high standards, keeping their coins close to the specified weight and purity. But it was also a matter of power and reputation. Athens was a dominant force in the Aegean, a centre of trade and culture, and its coins carried that prestige with them. Trust in the currency reflected trust in the city that issued it. While Athens rose to prominence on its silver, the Persian Empire to the east had its own relationship with the metal. The Persians used both gold and silver coinage, with the gold daric and silver siglos as their principal denominations. The empire was vast, stretching from Egypt to India, and managing such far-flung territories required a reliable monetary system. Persian coins, like Greek coins, derived their value partly from the precious metal they contained, and partly from the authority of the power that struck them. A Persian silver coin carried with it the weight of imperial power, the certainty that it would be accepted throughout the empire's domains. When Alexander of Macedon conquered the Persian Empire in the late 4th century before the Common Era, he seized enormous quantities of silver and gold that the Persian kings had accumulated over generations. Some estimates suggest he captured more than 180,000 talents of precious metal, an almost incomprehensible fortune. Alexander used this wealth to mint coins in enormous quantities, spreading Greek-style silver coinage across his vast empire. Even after his death and the fragmentation of his conquests, the monetary practices he had established persisted, creating a relatively unified zone of silver currency stretching from Greece to India. This Hellenistic world, as historians call the Greek-influenced civilization that emerged after Alexander, ran largely on silver. Cities competed to mint the most attractive and trustworthy coins. Trade flourished as merchants could calculate prices in silver, with confidence that the currency would hold its value. The monetary sophistication of this era was considerable, with banking operations, letters of credit, and complex financial instruments emerging to facilitate long-distance trade. All of it rested on the foundation of silver, the tangible metal that everyone agreed to value. Far to the east, in China, silver played a different but equally important role. The Chinese had discovered silver mining early and used the metal for various purposes, though not initially as currency in the same way as the Mediterranean world. Chinese money tended to be bronze or copper coins with square holes in the centre, strung together on cords for larger transactions. But silver was valued as a store of wealth, a way of preserving prosperity across generations. As trade between China and the West developed, particularly along the routes known collectively as the Silk Road, silver became a crucial medium of exchange, one of the few things that distant cultures could agree upon as universally valuable. The Roman Republic, rising to power in Italy during the 3rd century before the Common Era, created its own silver currency that would become one of the most influential coins in history. The denarius, introduced in 211 before the Common Era during the desperate years of the Second Punic War against Hannibal, became the standard Roman silver coin for 4 centuries. The denarius weighed about 4.5 grams of silver, roughly the weight of a modern dime, and bore the symbols of Rome's power and pride. Early denarii featured the goddess Roma on one side and the divine twins Castor and Pollux on their horses on the reverse. As Roman power grew and political competition intensified, the images on coins became more varied and personal. Generals and politicians used coinage as a form of propaganda, depicting their own achievements and their ancestors' glories. By the late Republic, coins had become small billboards, carrying political messages across the empire. The denarius unified the Roman economy in ways that had not been possible before. From Britain to Syria, from the Rhine to the Sahara, Roman silver coins circulated as a common currency. Soldiers on the frontiers received their pay in denarii. Tax collectors demanded payment in them. Merchants used them to settle accounts across vast distances. The monetary unity helped bind together the enormous diversity of the Roman Empire, creating a common economic language that transcended differences of culture and tongue. But maintaining the integrity of silver coinage required discipline, and discipline, over the long span of centuries, proved difficult to sustain. The temptation to stretch the currency, to pay for wars and public works by reducing the silver content while maintaining the face value, was ever present. And gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, Roman emperors began to succumb to that temptation. The Emperor Nero, in the 1st century of the Common Era, reduced the silver content of the denarius by about 10%, and also reduced its weight slightly. The change was subtle enough that most people probably did not notice immediately, but a precedent had been set. Subsequent emperors found it convenient to continue the process, each generation debasing the coinage a bit more. By the reign of Marcus Aurelius in the late 2nd century, the denarius contained perhaps 75% silver. By the time of Septimius Severus in the early 3rd century, it was down to 50%, and during the crisis of the 3rd century, when the empire teetered on the edge of collapse, the debasement accelerated catastrophically. The Antoninianus, introduced in the 3rd century as a coin supposedly worth 2 denarii, began with a silver content of perhaps 50%. By the middle of the century, it contained barely 5% silver, little more than a bronze coin with a thin silver wash. Merchants recognized that the coins were worth far less than their face value suggested. Prices rose dramatically as people demanded more and more coins for the same goods, a classical case of inflation driven by currency, debasement. The sophisticated monetary economy that had characterized the Roman Empire for centuries began to fragment, retreating towards simpler patterns of payment in kind and local barter. The late Roman Empire managed to stabilize somewhat under Diocletian and Constantine in the late 3rd and early 4th centuries, partly by introducing new coinages and attempting to restore confidence. Constantine's solidus, a gold coin, became the reliable anchor of the reformed currency. But silver coinage never quite recovered its former role. The denarius, that coin that had once been the backbone of Roman commerce, faded into history, replaced by other denominations and eventually largely abandoned as the empire split and evolved into its medieval successors. The story of Roman silver coinage offers a lesson that would echo through the centuries. A sound currency, consistently maintained, can facilitate prosperity and bind together diverse peoples. But currency requires trust, and trust requires discipline. When governments yield to the temptation to debase their money, to pay today's expenses by undermining tomorrow's currency, the consequences unfold over generations. The process is rarely dramatic in any single year, but the accumulated effect can be devastating. As the Roman Empire in the West gave way to the kingdoms of medieval Europe, silver remained valuable, but the sophisticated monetary economy largely collapsed. The story of silver's next chapter would be one of scarcity and gradual rediscovery, of new mines found and new currencies created, of silver once again connecting distant peoples through networks of trade. But that story was still ahead, waiting in the medieval centuries to come, when the Roman Empire in the West finally fragmented in the 5th century of the Common Era. Much of the infrastructure that had supported its monetary economy disappeared with it. The great mints that had produced millions of coins fell silent or operated sporadically. The trade routes that had carried silver across continents became dangerous or impassable. The complex banking and credit systems that had facilitated commerce collapsed into simpler, more local arrangements. And silver itself, that metal which had circulated so freely in Roman times, became increasingly scarce. Historians sometimes speak of a medieval silver famine, a shortage of precious metals that characterized much of early medieval Europe. The phrase famine perhaps overstates the situation, but there was indeed a pronounced scarcity. The great silver mines that had supplied Rome were largely exhausted or had become inaccessible. New sources had not yet been discovered. What silver existed was hoarded, buried in treasuries or hidden in the ground during times of trouble, removed from circulation. Without sufficient coinage, the European economy contracted. Barter became more common. Payment in kind, settling obligations with grain or livestock or labour, replaced monetary transactions for many purposes. This scarcity was not total, of course. Some silver coins continued to circulate, particularly Byzantine gold and silver from the Eastern Empire, and various local currencies produced by emerging kingdoms. But compared to the abundance of Roman times, silver was rare and precious. The economy adapted, as economies do, finding ways to function with limited monetary media. But the lack of silver constrained growth, limited trade, and made long-distance commerce more difficult. The gradual recovery began slowly, almost imperceptibly, as new silver deposits were discovered in Central Europe. Deep beneath the Harz Mountains, in what is now central Germany, silver-bearing ores waited to be found. Around 968, according to tradition, silver was discovered at Rammelsburg, near the town of Goslar. The deposit proved remarkably rich, and mining operations began in earnest. For the first time in centuries, substantial quantities of new silver began flowing into the European economy. The discovery of Rammelsburg silver came at a propitious moment. The Holy Roman Empire, that medieval confederation of Germanic states, was consolidating under the Ottonian dynasty. The empire needed currency to pay soldiers, facilitate trade, and assert its authority. The Rammelsburg mines provided that currency. The silver extracted from these mountains would help fund the empire's ambitions and gradually restore a monetary economy to Central Europe. Mining in the medieval period was difficult, dangerous work carried out with technology that had advanced little since Roman times. Miners worked by lamplight, following veins of ore through narrow tunnels. The rock had to be broken with hammers and wedges, the ore carried to the surface in baskets, then crushed and washed and smelted. The process was slow, labour-intensive, and claimed many lives through accidents, exhaustion, and the gradual poisoning that came from breathing underground air thick with dust and fumes. Yet the work continued, driven by the value of what emerged from the darkness. Other silver deposits were discovered across Central Europe in the centuries that followed. The mountains of Saxony, Bohemia, and Silesia all yielded silver to patient, persistent digging. Mining towns sprang up wherever deposits were found, communities that existed solely to extract and process the precious metal. These towns had a characteristic quality, a rough pragmatism mixed with sudden wealth, as fortunes could be made or lost depending on the richness of the ore and the luck of the excavation. The silver that flowed from these Central European mines gradually revitalized European coinage. The silver penny became the standard coin across much of medieval Europe, produced in countless local variations but following a common basic pattern. In England, the silver penny was virtually the only coin produced for centuries, serving for all transactions from the smallest purchase to the largest property transfer. People learned to cut pennies into halves or quarters when smaller denominations were needed, a practice that left its mark on the language. The British farthing, worth 1/4 of a penny, takes its name from this cutting, from forthing. The silver penny was not a large coin. It contained perhaps a gram or so of silver, sometimes more, sometimes less, depending on when and where it was minted. But these small coins, produced in enormous quantities over centuries, sustained the medieval economy. They allowed trade to expand beyond barter, made it possible to save and accumulate wealth in a compact form, and facilitated the slow commercial revival that characterized the later Middle Ages. One of the most remarkable developments in Central European silver mining came in the early 16th century in the mountains of Bohemia. In 1519, a rich silver deposit was discovered near a town called Joachimsthal, a name that translates roughly as Joachim's Valley. The mines there proved extraordinarily productive, and the counts who controlled the region began minting large silver coins from the local ore. These coins, worth about a day's wages for a skilled craftsman, came to be known as Joachimsthalers, later shortened simply to thalers. The thaler was a substantial coin, containing about an ounce of silver, far larger than the small pennies that had dominated medieval coinage. Its size and the consistency with which it was produced made it popular for international trade and large transactions. Other regions began producing similar coins, each with local variations in design and name. In the Netherlands, the coin was called a daalder. In Spain, it became the dollar. The word would travel across oceans and centuries, eventually giving its name to the currency of the United States and various other nations. The silver coins minted in a Bohemian valley in the early 16th century carried within them the linguistic seed of currencies that would dominate global commerce centuries later. The growing availability of silver in medieval Europe enabled the development of increasingly sophisticated financial instruments. Merchants who traded across long distances faced a practical problem. Carrying large quantities of silver was dangerous and cumbersome. Robbers haunted the roads, and even an honest journey could end in disaster through accident or weather. A merchant might spend months accumulating goods to sell at a distant fair, only to see the profit stolen on the journey home. There had to be a safer way. The solution emerged gradually through the practices of Italian merchant bankers. Rather than carrying silver across Europe, a merchant could deposit it with a banker in one city and receive a letter of credit, a written promise that the sum could be collected from the banker's correspondent in another city. The merchant travelled with paper rather than metal, and if the letter were lost or stolen, it was worthless to anyone but the named recipient. The system required trust, of course, a network of bankers who honoured each other's commitments. But such networks developed, particularly among Italian banking families who maintained branches and agents across Europe. The Medici of Florence were perhaps the most famous of these banking dynasties, but they were far from alone. The Bardi and Peruzzi, also of Florence, had operated on an even larger scale before their spectacular failure in the 1340s when the English King Edward III defaulted on his debts. German banking families like the Fuggers of Augsburg would rise to prominence in the 15th and 16th centuries, financing emperors and kings, funding mining operations, and managing the complex finances of an increasingly commercial economy. All of this sophisticated finance rested ultimately on silver, the tangible metal that backed letters and promises, the substance that gave value to the paper. The Northern European trade network known as the Hanseatic League played a crucial role in the movement of silver and the goods it purchased. The Hansa was not a state, but rather a confederation of merchant guilds and trading cities, stretching from the Baltic to the North Sea, from what is now Russia to England and the Netherlands. Hanseatic merchants traded in timber and furs, grain and fish, cloth and metal goods, and all of these transactions required currency. Silver flowed through Hanseatic networks, paying for goods in one port, accumulating in another, gradually redistributing itself according to the patterns of trade. The League established contours, trading posts in foreign cities where Hanseatic merchants could conduct business according to their own rules and under their own protection. The contour in London, the contour in Bergen, the great complex in Novgorod. These were little islands of northern European commercial culture embedded in foreign lands, and silver was the common language they spoke. A merchant from Lübeck could do business with a merchant from Riga or Visby or Danzig, confident that their silver coins would be recognized and valued consistently, allowing trade to flow with minimal friction. Venice and Genoa, the great maritime republics of Italy, served as intermediaries between the silver-rich economies of Europe and the gold-rich economies of the Islamic world and beyond. These cities sat at the crossroads of trade routes, where European silver could be exchanged for spices from the Indies, silk from China and gold from Africa. The exchange rates between silver and gold were crucial in this trade, as they determined the terms on which goods could be obtained. A Venetian merchant purchasing pepper in Alexandria with silver needed to know how much gold that silver would bring, since the pepper seller likely preferred gold. The ratios fluctuated with supply and demand, creating opportunities for profit but also risks for those who miscalculated. The Venetians and Genoese maintained commercial colonies throughout the Mediterranean and Black Sea, outposts from which they conducted their far-flung trade. Silver from European mines flowed south and east through these networks, while gold, spices and luxury goods flowed back. The Italian merchants grew wealthy on this exchange, and their cities became showcases of art and architecture, testaments to what silver and trade could build. The Doge's palace in Venice, the palazzi of Genoa's merchant princes, stood as monuments to silver's quiet power, the way it connected distant peoples and created prosperity for those who managed its flow. The technical aspects of silver production improved steadily through the medieval period, though progress was slow and incremental rather than revolutionary. Miners learned to follow veins more efficiently, to shore up tunnels more safely, to drain water from deep shafts using pumps and water wheels. Smelters refined their techniques, achieving higher extraction rates from the ore. Assayers developed methods for testing the purity of silver with greater accuracy, allowing merchants and moneyers to have confidence in what they were trading or minting. One important innovation was the liquation process, perfected in Central Europe in the 15th century, which allowed the separation of silver from copper in mixed ores. This opened up deposits that had previously been uneconomical to mine, as the silver could now be extracted efficiently from ores that contained relatively small amounts of the precious metal mixed with base metals. The process involved carefully heating the ore to separate the metals based on their different melting points, a delicate operation requiring skill and experience. The gradual accumulation of silver in medieval Europe had effects that rippled through society. The revival of towns and cities, the growth of markets and fairs, the increasing specialization of labor. All of these depended partly on having a reliable monetary system, and that system required silver. Peasants who might once have paid rents entirely in kind, or labour increasingly paid at least partly in coin. Craftsmen sold their goods for money rather than bartering them. Even the church, that great institution that spanned all of medieval Europe, collected its tithes and fees increasingly in silver. The silver penny in your purse, if you had lived in medieval Europe, would have been more than just a means of payment. It would have represented connection to a wider world, participation in a commercial economy that stretched beyond your village or town. That small coin linked you to miners working deep beneath the Harz Mountains, to bankers in Florence keeping their careful accounts, to merchants travelling the roads with their wagons of goods, to the great fairs where Europe came together to trade. It was a tangible piece of a vast, mostly invisible network of exchange and trust. Yet even as Central European silver gradually revitalized the monetary economy, it remained limited compared to what was to come. The deposits, while significant, were not enormous. The technology of extraction, while improving, remained primitive by later standards. Silver was still precious, still relatively scarce, still carefully hoarded and slowly accumulated. The transformation that would truly flood the world with silver, that would connect continents through silver's flow, still lay ahead. waiting in mountains across an ocean that medieval Europeans were only beginning to contemplate crossing. The journey to those distant mountains and the silver empire they would create would reshape the world in ways that no merchant in Joachimsthal or banker in Venice could have imagined. The silver that flowed from European mines, substantial though it seemed to medieval merchants and princes, would prove to be merely a prelude. Across an ocean that few Europeans had yet crossed, beneath mountains that no European had yet climbed, silver deposits of almost unimaginable scale waited to be discovered. The encounter between the Old World and the New set in motion when Christopher Columbus sailed westward in 1492 would transform many things, but perhaps no transformation was more profound or far-reaching than what happened to silver and through silver to the global economy. The Spanish conquistadors who swept through the Americas in the early 16th century were motivated by many things: religious zeal, desire for glory, hunger for land. But gold was high among their goals. They had heard tales of golden cities, of an El Dorado where the precious metal was so common that buildings were roofed with it. They found some gold, to be sure, particularly in the Caribbean and in Mexico and Peru. But what they found in even greater quantities, what would ultimately prove far more significant for the world's economy, was silver. The first major silver mines in Spanish America were developed in Mexico, beginning in the 1540s. Zacatecas, discovered in 1546, proved particularly rich. Guanajuato, Taxco, and other sites followed. The Spanish colonial authorities organized mining operations with a combination of imported European techniques and local labor, creating an industry that would produce vast quantities of silver for centuries. But even the Mexican mines, productive as they were, paled in comparison to what was discovered in the high mountains of South America. In 1545, according to the story that has come down through history, an indigenous man named Diego Hualpa was searching for a lost llama on a mountain in what is now Bolivia. The altitude was extreme, nearly 16,000 feet above sea level, and as night fell and temperatures dropped, Hualpa sought shelter. He built a small fire for warmth, and in the morning he noticed something remarkable. The heat had melted some of the rock around his fire, revealing silvery metal beneath. Whether the story is precisely true or embellished over time, we cannot know for certain. But what is certain is that someone discovered silver on that mountain, and the discovery would change the world. The mountain came to be called Cerro Rico, the Rich Mountain, and the Spanish city that grew at its base was named Potosí. Within a few decades, Potosí had transformed from an empty mountainside into one of the largest cities in the world, comparable in population to London or Paris. At its peak around the turn of the 17th century, perhaps 160,000 people lived there, drawn by silver and the opportunities it created. The city that silver built sat at an altitude where the air was thin and cold, where nothing grew easily and everything had to be imported from lower elevations. But silver made it worthwhile. Silver made it possible. The scale of production from Cerro Rico was extraordinary. During its most productive decades in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, the mountain yielded perhaps 200 tons of silver annually. Over the course of 2.5 centuries, from its discovery until the early 19th century when production finally declined substantially, Cerro Rico produced an estimated 45,000 tons of silver. To put this in perspective, This single mountain may have produced more than half of all the silver that entered the world economy during those centuries. It was a mountain gradually being consumed, its silver-rich ore extracted ton by ton, its wealth distributed across the globe. The process of extracting silver from Cerro Rico and refining it into pure metal was complex and required substantial labour. The Spanish employed a system they called the mita, based loosely on Inca traditions of tribute labour. Under this system, indigenous communities were required to provide workers for the mines, men who would spend months at a time working underground, extracting ore in conditions that were difficult and often dangerous. The tunnels extended deep into the mountain, following veins of silver ore, and the work was carried out by lamplight in cramped, dusty passages. The human cost of Potosí's silver was considerable. Many workers died in mining accidents or from the gradual effects of working in such harsh conditions. Others succumbed to illness, their bodies worn down by the altitude, the physical demands of the labour and exposure to mercury, which was used in the refining process. The exact number of deaths is unknown and debated by historians, but it was certainly substantial, a dark shadow behind silver's gleam. The wealth that flowed from Potosí came at a price paid by those who had the least say in the enterprise. The silver ore extracted from the mountain had to be processed to separate the metal from the rock. Initially, the Spanish used traditional smelting techniques, heating the ore to high temperatures to melt out the silver. But much of Potosí's ore was of relatively low grade, with the silver dispersed throughout rock in ways that made simple smelting inefficient. The breakthrough came with the introduction of the patio process, also known as the amalgamation process, which used mercury to extract silver from ore. The patio process involved crushing the ore into powder, mixing it with water, salt and mercury, then spreading it in large outdoor patios where workers would turn it regularly with their feet or with tools. Over weeks or months, the mercury would bind with the silver, forming an amalgam that could be separated from the remaining rock. The amalgam was then heated to evaporate the mercury, leaving pure silver behind. The process was slow but effective, allowing the extraction of silver from ores that would otherwise have been uneconomical to mine. Mercury for the amalgamation process came primarily from Huancavelica in Peru, where the Spanish had found substantial mercury deposits. The mercury mines were, if anything, even more dangerous than the silver mines, as mercury vapour is highly toxic, and the effects of mercury poisoning were not well understood at the time. Workers at Huancavelica faced shortened lifespans and debilitating illness. The silver that glittered in the treasuries of Spain and circulated in the markets of the world was linked through invisible chains to these workers in the mountains of South America, to their labour and their suffering. The silver from Potosí and the Mexican mines had to be transported to the coast, a journey of hundreds of miles across difficult terrain. From the ports of South America, particularly Lima, and from Mexican ports like Veracruz, the silver was loaded onto ships bound for Spain. These treasure fleets sailed according to a regular schedule, heavily armed against pirates and organised into convoys for mutual protection. The arrival of the fleet in Spanish ports was a major event, as the silver it carried would flow into the Spanish treasury, pay the crown's debts, and distribute through the economy. The Spanish pieces of 8, the silver coins minted from American silver, became the first truly global currency. Also known as the Spanish dollar or the peso, these coins contained approximately 1 ounce of silver and could be physically divided into 8 smaller pieces or bits, for making change. 2 bits equaled a quarter, a linguistic fossil that persists in English even today. The pieces of 8 were produced in vast quantities at mints in Mexico City, Potosí and Lima, and they circulated everywhere Spanish power and trade reached, which by the late 16th century meant virtually everywhere. These coins appeared in markets from Manila to Amsterdam, from the Caribbean to the Mediterranean. English colonists in North America used them as their primary currency well into the 19th century. Chinese merchants accepted them readily. The pieces of 8 were trusted because they were consistently produced to a known standard, and because silver itself was universally valued. A merchant in any port city in the world would likely accept Spanish silver coins, confident that they could be used to purchase goods elsewhere or melted down for their metal content. But the Spanish silver did not simply circulate within the Spanish Empire or the European economy. It flowed in enormous quantities to Asia, particularly to China, creating the first truly global pattern of trade. The route was remarkable in its extent and complexity. Silver mined in the mountains of South America would be transported to the Pacific coast of Mexico, loaded onto ships that sailed across the Pacific to Manila in the Philippines, then transferred to Chinese merchants who brought it to China. This trans-Pacific trade, carried by ships known as Manila galleons, operated from 1565 until the early 19th century, and it may have carried as much silver to Asia as crossed the Atlantic to Europe. Why did so much silver flow to China? The answer lay in China's monetary system and its economic relationship with the world. During the Ming dynasty, which ruled China from 1368 to 1644, the government required that taxes be paid in silver. This created an enormous domestic demand for the metal. China's economy was large and productive, manufacturing silk, porcelain, tea, and countless other goods that the rest of the world desired. But China had relatively little that it wanted to import, at least until the opium trade developed in later centuries. The result was a persistent trade surplus. Foreign merchants wanting to buy Chinese goods had to pay in silver, the one thing China consistently wanted. The flow of silver from the Americas to China was so substantial that it affected the global economy in ways that are still being understood by historians and economists. Silver connected distant continents in a web of trade. A Chinese farmer paying taxes in silver might be using coins minted in Potosí or Mexico, coins that had crossed 2 oceans to reach him. A Spanish merchant buying silk in Manila was participating in an economic system that stretched from the mines of South America to the workshops of China. The world economy was being knit together by silver threads. In Europe, the influx of American silver had profound effects. Prices rose steadily through the 16th and into the 17th century, a phenomenon historians call the price revolution. The increase was not dramatic by modern standards. Prices perhaps tripled over a century and a half, but it was significant for an economy accustomed to relatively stable prices. The inflation was caused partly by population growth and economic expansion, but the flood of American silver certainly contributed. More money chasing the same quantity of goods tends to push prices upward, a principle that would be rediscovered and refined by economists in later centuries. The effects of this inflation were uneven, benefiting some and harming others. Debtors found it easier to repay loans as money became more plentiful, and wages gradually rose. Creditors and those on fixed incomes, conversely, found their wealth eroding as each coin bought less than before. Landowners who could raise rents benefited, while peasants paying those rents struggled. The redistributive effects of the inflation contributed to social tensions that would erupt periodically in revolts and conflicts. Spain itself, despite being the empire that controlled the silver, paradoxically struggled economically through much of this period. The silver flowing from the Americas passed through Spain but did not stay there. It was used to pay for imported goods from more industrialized regions like the Netherlands and Italy, to finance Spain's numerous wars, and to cover the lavish spending of the royal court. Spain never developed the manufacturing base that might have allowed it to capture more of the value that its silver represented. The phenomenon of a nation rich in resources but poor in development would recur throughout history, a pattern sometimes called the resource curse. The cities of the Low Countries, Amsterdam, Antwerp and others, became major beneficiaries of Spanish silver. These cities developed sophisticated financial and commercial institutions, and much of the silver that Spain spent on goods and services ended up in Dutch and Flemish hands. Amsterdam's bank, established in 1609, accepted deposits of silver and gold and issued receipts that could be used as money, pioneering forms of banking that would spread across Europe. The silver economy had become so large and complex that it required new institutions to manage it. The environmental effects of silver mining in the Americas were also substantial, though they went largely unremarked at the time. Forests were cut down to provide timber for mine shafts and fuel for smelting. Mercury contamination from the refining process polluted soil and water around mining centres. The landscape around Potosí was transformed, the mountain gradually honeycombed with tunnels, the surrounding valleys filled with tailings and waste rock. These were the hidden costs of silver, the marks left on the land that would persist long after the mines were exhausted. Yet for all its costs, the silver of the Americas did connect the world in unprecedented ways. A merchant in Seville could purchase goods manufactured in China. A Chinese official could collect taxes in silver minted in Mexico. The Manila galleons sailing annually across the Pacific created a regular link between Asia and the Americas. The treasure fleets crossing the Atlantic bound Europe and the New World together. Silver was the common language that allowed these distant regions to trade, to exchange not just goods but ideas and technologies, to begin the process of creating a truly global economy. The story of Potosí and the other American silver mines is one of remarkable wealth, extracted at considerable human cost, flowing across oceans to reshape economies and empires. The silver gleaming in the treasure chambers of Madrid, or the counting houses of Amsterdam, or the tax offices of Beijing represented labour in the thin air of the Andes, risk on storm-tossed seas, and the beginning of economic relationships that would bind the world together ever more tightly. It was perhaps the first great wave of globalization, driven by silver's particular qualities, its value, its divisibility, its universal acceptability, and by human desires for the goods and luxuries that silver could purchase. By the middle of the 17th century, the patterns were well established. Silver flowed from the Americas, west across the Pacific and east across the Atlantic, then gradually made its way from Europe to Asia through overland routes and sea trade. The quantity was staggering. Estimates suggest that perhaps 150,000 tons of silver left the Americas between 1500 and 1800, representing an enormous transfer of wealth. But as we shall see, silver's story was far from over. New chapters would unfold in Europe. where silver's role in monetary systems and political debates would continue to evolve, and eventually in a reunited America where silver would again play a central role in economic life and political controversy. The silver that flowed from the Americas through the 16th and 17th centuries did more than change trade patterns and mint coins. It shaped how Europeans thought about wealth itself, about the nature of economic power and the proper role of governments in managing their nation's prosperity. The economic philosophy that emerged from this age of silver is known to historians as mercantilism, and it rested on a belief that seems simple, almost obvious, but that would eventually prove to be incomplete. Mercantilists believed that the wealth of a nation consisted primarily of the precious metals it possessed. Gold and silver were not merely convenient forms of money, they were wealth in its purest, most concentrated form. From this premise, it followed that a nation should do everything possible to accumulate precious metals and prevent them from leaving. Exports should be encouraged, bringing silver in. Imports should be restricted, preventing silver from flowing out. Colonies should be exploited for their resources, particularly any gold or silver they might contain, and required to trade exclusively with the mother country. The goal was to create a favourable balance of trade, selling more than you bought, with the difference made up in silver. This way of thinking dominated European economic policy for roughly 2 centuries, from the early 1500s through the middle 1700s. Nations competed fiercely to accumulate silver, viewing international trade as a kind of zero-sum game where one country's gain was necessarily another's loss. If France accumulated silver, it was at Spain's expense, or England's, or the Dutch republics. The silver hoarded in one treasury was silver missing from another. This competitive hoarding shaped diplomatic relations, motivated wars, and justified colonialism as nations sought to control sources of precious metals. Spain, of course, seemed to be the great winner in this mercantile race. The empire controlled the richest silver mines in the world, and the treasure fleets brought their gleaming cargo to Spanish ports year after year. Spanish power in the 16th century was formidable, sustained by American silver. Spanish armies dominated European battlefields. Spanish diplomacy carried weight in every court. The Spanish Empire stretched around the world, from the Americas to the Philippines, and silver seemed to flow endlessly from its colonial possessions. Yet something paradoxical happened. Despite all this silver, Spain declined. The decline was gradual, not sudden, unfolding over generations rather than years. Spain in 1600 was still powerful. Spain in 1700 was noticeably weaker, a secondary power rather than the dominant force it had been. The reasons for this decline are complex and debated by historians, but the role of silver, or rather what Spain failed to do with its silver, is part of the story. The silver that arrived in Spanish ports flowed quickly out again, used to purchase manufactured goods from other countries, to pay for imported food, to finance wars that drained resources without bringing lasting gains. Spain never developed the manufacturing industries that might have allowed it to produce the goods its people and its empire needed. It was easier, perhaps, to buy what was needed with silver than to build the workshops and train the artisans who could make such things domestically. But this meant that the wealth represented by silver was constantly leaving, enriching other nations while Spain itself remained relatively poor despite its access to precious metals. The lesson, though it would not be fully understood for generations, was that wealth is not the same as money. True wealth lies in productive capacity, in the ability to create goods and services that others value, not merely in accumulating precious metals. The paradox of Spanish silver would later be recognized as an early example of what economists call the resource curse, or Dutch disease, the phenomenon where abundant natural resources can actually hinder economic development if they discourage the growth of other industries. But in the 16th and 17th centuries, this pattern was not yet understood. It seemed mysterious that Spain, possessing so much silver, should nonetheless struggle economically, while nations like the Dutch Republic and England, with no significant sources of precious metals, should grow prosperous and powerful. The Dutch, in particular, demonstrated an alternative path to prosperity. The United Provinces, as the Dutch Republic was formerly known, had little in the way of natural resources. It was a small country, much of it reclaimed from the sea, with limited agricultural potential and no mines. What it had was commerce, finance, and innovation. Dutch merchants dominated European trade, their ships carrying goods from every corner of the known world. Amsterdam became the commercial capital of Europe, its warehouses filled with spices and textiles, timber and grain, all the varied commodities that move through global trade networks. Dutch financial institutions were particularly sophisticated. The Bank of Amsterdam, established in 1609, accepted deposits of gold and silver coins from merchants who needed a safe place to store their wealth. In return, the bank issued receipts that could be used to make payments, transferred from one account to another by entries in the bank's ledgers. These bank receipts were often more convenient than actual coins, especially for large transactions, and they circulated as a form of paper money backed by the precious metals held in the bank's vaults. This was not the first such institution. Italian banks had pioneered similar practices, but the Bank of Amsterdam operated on a scale and with a reliability that made it a model for others. The development of paper money backed by silver represented a crucial evolution in how money functioned. Physical silver remained the ultimate store of value, the substance that gave the paper its worth. But for everyday commerce, especially large-scale transactions, paper was more practical. A merchant could carry a note worth thousands of guilders in silver without the burden of transporting the actual metal. The system required trust, of course. The bank had to maintain adequate reserves, and merchants had to believe that they could exchange their paper for silver if they wished. When that trust was maintained, the system worked beautifully, allowing commerce to expand beyond what would have been possible with only metallic currency. England, emerging as a major power in the 17th and 18th centuries, developed its own sophisticated relationship with silver and money. England had no significant silver mines, and much of the silver that entered the country came through trade or was captured from Spanish ships. This scarcity of silver created chronic problems with the coinage. As silver coins were frequently clipped, people would shave off small amounts of metal from the edges, or debased. By the 1690s, the state of English silver coinage had become quite poor, with many coins substantially lighter than their face value indicated. The Great Recoinage of 1696 was an ambitious attempt to restore confidence in English currency. The government called in old, debased coins and reissued new ones of proper weight and purity. The operation was enormous, requiring the recall and remelting of most of the silver coinage in circulation. It was expensive and disruptive, but it successfully restored a sound currency. overseeing much of this process and serving as Master of the Royal Mint from 1699 until his death in 1727 was Isaac Newton, better known for his contributions to physics and mathematics than for his monetary work. Newton's role at the Mint was more than ceremonial. He took seriously the task of maintaining the coinage and preventing counterfeiting. He also had to determine the proper ratio between gold and silver, the rate at which the two metals should exchange for each other in England's bimetallic currency system. Newton set the ratio at approximately 15.5 ounces of silver to 1 ounce of gold, based on prevailing market prices. This ratio, though reasonable at the time, inadvertently favoured gold slightly. Because gold was marginally undervalued at the official ratio compared to its market value elsewhere, gold tended to stay in England while silver drained away. Over time, this contributed to England gradually becoming a gold standard country rather than maintaining a true bimetallic system, though this outcome was not Newton's intention. The British East India Company, chartered in 1600, became one of the principal channels through which silver flowed to Asia. The company existed to profit from trade with India and other Asian regions, importing spices, textiles, tea, and other goods that commanded high prices in European markets. But what could Britain offer in exchange? Asian markets had limited interest in European manufactured goods. What they wanted was silver. So the East India Company shipped vast quantities of silver to India and China, using it to purchase the Asian goods that would be sold at a profit back home. This one-directional flow of silver troubled some English observers who worried about the loss of precious metal from the kingdom. Should England allow its silver to drain away to foreign lands? But others recognised that the trade was profitable despite the silver outflow. The goods purchased with silver in Asia sold for far more than their cost when brought back to England. The silver facilitated trade that generated wealth, even if the silver itself left the country. This was a glimmer of understanding that would be more fully developed by later economists. Adam Smith, the Scottish philosopher and economist, thought deeply about silver and its role in the economy. His great work, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, devoted considerable attention to questions of money and precious metals. Smith argued that the mercantilist obsession with accumulating gold and silver was misguided. Precious metals, he suggested, were useful primarily as a medium of exchange, not as wealth itself. The true wealth of a nation lay in its productive capacity, in the goods and services it could produce, not in the quantity of metal sitting in its treasury. Smith used silver prices and their fluctuations over time as evidence for some of his arguments about value and trade. He noted how the discovery of American silver mines had affected prices in Europe, how the increased supply of silver had gradually changed what the metal could purchase. But he also recognized that silver remained a reasonably stable measure of value over the long term, more reliable than most other commodities. His analysis was careful and empirical, drawing on historical price data to support his arguments. While Smith's work ranged far beyond questions of silver, his treatment of the metal and its role in the economy helped reshape how people understood wealth and trade. Through the 18th century, most European nations maintained silver coinage as part of their monetary systems, though the specifics varied considerably. France used both gold louis and silver écus. The German states produced thalers of varying quality and weight, depending on which principality struck them. Spanish pieces of 8 continued to circulate internationally, accepted far beyond the boundaries of the Spanish Empire. The lack of true international standardization created opportunities for those who understood the relative values of different coinages, as silver might be undervalued in one country and overvalued in another, allowing arbitrage for those who could transport the metal between markets. The American colonies, far from Europe but connected to it through trade, relied heavily on silver for their money. They used whatever coins came to hand. Spanish pieces of 8 were particularly common, along with English shillings and various other European silver coins. The colonies also experimented with paper money, as we have explored before, but silver remained the tangible backing that people trusted. When the colonies eventually became an independent nation and began creating their own currency system, they defined their dollar in terms of silver, basing it on the familiar Spanish silver dollar that had circulated in the colonies for generations. The 18th century also saw the emergence of a more scientific approach to understanding money and economics. Thinkers began to analyze systematically how money functioned, how trade worked, how wealth was created and distributed. Silver and gold were central to these investigations, as they had been the primary forms of money for so long. But the questions being asked were becoming more sophisticated. What gave silver its value? Was it the labour required to mine and refine it, as some argued? Or was it simply scarcity combined with universal demand? How did changes in the supply of silver affect prices and wages? These questions would occupy economists for generations. The century also witnessed gradual improvements in the technology of silver mining and refining. Deeper shafts could be sunk as pumping technology improved. Better smelting techniques extracted more silver from ore. The scientific revolution was being applied to practical problems of production, increasing efficiency and output. These improvements were incremental rather than revolutionary, but over time they mattered, allowing more silver to be produced from the same ore and making previously uneconomical deposits worth mining. Throughout this period, silver remained central to how people thought about and used money. A merchant's wealth was measured partly in how much silver he possessed. A government's power was gauged partly by the size of its silver reserves. Treaties sometimes included provisions for payment in silver. Dowries were calculated in silver. The metal had become so deeply embedded in economic and social life that imagining a world without it as the basis for money was difficult. Even as paper currency became more common, it was understood to be a convenience, a representation of silver rather than a replacement for it. The paper derived its value from the silver it could supposedly be exchanged for. As the 18th century drew to a close, silver remained essential to the global economy, linking continents through trade, providing the foundation for monetary systems, serving as the tangible substance that backed the increasingly complex financial instruments being developed. But changes were stirring. New sources of silver would soon be discovered. New debates about the proper role of silver in monetary systems would emerge, and eventually silver's long reign as the primary substance of money would be challenged, though that challenge still lay ahead, waiting in the 19th century's mining booms and political controversies. For now, silver continued its work, flowing through the channels of trade, accumulating in treasuries, passing from hand to hand in markets across the world, the quiet metal that connected humanity in its commercial endeavours. The 19th century would bring silver back to the forefront of economic and political life, in ways that few could have predicted as the century began. The catalyst was geography and geology, the particular arrangement of mountains and minerals in the western portions of North America. As the United States expanded westward, pushing across prairies and over mountain ranges, settlers and prospectors discovered that the land held treasures beneath its surface. Gold captured the initial attention, with rushes to California in 1849 and other locations in subsequent years. But silver, quieter and less celebrated, would ultimately prove even more significant for the nation's economy and politics. The great Western silver discoveries began modestly enough. Small deposits were found here and there, worked by individual prospectors or small partnerships. But in 1859, something larger was discovered in the hills of what would soon become Nevada. The story, like many mining stories, involves luck and persistence in roughly equal measure. Prospectors searching for gold in the Virginia Range east of Lake Tahoe kept finding a troublesome blue-grey mud mixed with the gold they sought. The mud was heavy and interfered with their gold recovery. Some cursed it as a nuisance, but eventually someone thought to have the material assayed, tested to determine its composition. The results were remarkable. The troublesome mud was silver ore, extraordinarily rich silver ore. The deposit came to be known as the Comstock Lode, named after Henry Comstock, a prospector who claimed a share of the discovery, though his exact role remains somewhat unclear in the historical record. Whatever Comstock's contribution, the lode that bore his name would prove to be one of the richest silver deposits ever found. The main vein was enormous, a mass of silver-bearing ore that extended deep into the mountain. Over the following decades, the Comstock Lode would produce more than $400 million worth of silver and gold, an almost incomprehensible fortune at 19th century values. Mining the Comstock Lode required more sophisticated techniques than the individual prospectors of earlier gold rushes had employed. The ore lay deep underground, requiring tunnels that eventually extended thousands of feet into the earth. The shafts had to be timbered to prevent collapse, a technique that consumed vast quantities of lumber from the surrounding forests. The ore had to be raised to the surface, sorted, crushed, and processed to extract the precious metals, and the operation had to contend with underground water and extreme heat as the deeper levels were reached, challenges that required engineering solutions. The washer process, developed specifically for Comstock ore, improved upon older methods of extracting silver from complex ores. The process involved crushing the ore, roasting it to remove sulfur, then mixing it with salt, copper sulfate, and mercury in large rotating barrels called pans. The mixture was heated with steam, causing the mercury to amalgamate with the silver. The amalgam could then be separated and the mercury distilled off, leaving pure silver. The process was more efficient than earlier methods and could handle the particular characteristics of Comstock ore. It represented an advance in metallurgical technology, the kind of practical innovation that mining operations were constantly pursuing. The town of Virginia City grew up near the Comstock Lode, transforming almost overnight from empty hillside to bustling community. At its peak in the 1860s and 70s, Virginia City was one of the most important settlements in the American West, with perhaps 25,000 residents. The town had newspapers, theatres, saloons, churches, and all the institutions of civilization built on the wealth flowing from the mines beneath. Mark Twain spent time there in the 1860s as a young journalist, and his experiences in Virginia City would inform his later writing about the mining West. The Comstock Lode was merely the beginning. Other silver deposits were discovered throughout the mountainous West in rapid succession. Colorado's silver boom began in the 1860s and accelerated through the 70s. Leadville, high in the Rocky Mountains, became another silver city, producing enormous quantities of the metal. The Caribou mine, discovered in 1869, was particularly rich. Montana, Idaho, Arizona, all revealed silver deposits that drew prospectors and miners, that created instant towns and generated fortunes for a lucky few and modest wages for many more who worked in the mines. The flood of silver from these western mines began to affect markets and monetary policy. Silver had been relatively scarce in the United States during the first half of the 19th century, and little silver coinage had circulated, but now silver was abundant, pouring from the mountains in quantities that exceeded anything since the great days of Potosí. The miners and the states they enriched naturally wanted this silver to be coined, to serve as money, to maintain the value that silver had traditionally held. But changes in monetary policy, some already made and others contemplated, would frustrate these desires and create political controversies that would dominate American politics for a generation. The United States had officially operated on a bimetallic standard since the Coinage Act of 1792, with both gold and silver serving as money at a fixed ratio. But in practice, the system had never worked smoothly. Whenever the market price of one metal diverged from the official ratio, that metal would disappear from circulation, hoarded or exported, while the other metal dominated. Through much of the mid-19th century, gold had been slightly undervalued at the official ratio, so gold flowed into the country, and silver largely disappeared from circulation. Silver dollars in particular became so rare that people largely forgot about them. In 1873, Congress passed a comprehensive revision of the coinage laws, updating and consolidating previous legislation. Among its many provisions was the elimination of the standard silver dollar from the list of coins to be produced. This seemed uncontroversial at the time. The silver dollar had not circulated for years, and no one was demanding it. But the timing would prove unfortunate. Just as Congress demonetized silver, just as Western mines were beginning to produce silver in great quantities, the market price of silver began to fall relative to gold. Suddenly, silver miners wanted silver to be coined. They wanted to bring their metal to the mint and receive silver dollars in exchange, but the law no longer allowed it. The decision to drop the silver dollar from the coinage was later denounced by silver advocates as the crime of 1873, a deliberate conspiracy to enrich creditors at the expense of debtors and to benefit gold interests over silver. Whether the demonetization was a conscious conspiracy or simply an unfortunate bit of timing remains debated by historians. Probably it was some of both. Some legislators understood what they were doing, while others simply followed routine revisions of the coinage laws, without appreciating the long-term implications. But whatever the motivation, the effects were significant. Silver prices began to decline in the 1870s, and continued falling through the 80s and 90s. In 1872, an ounce of silver sold for about $1.32. By the middle of the 1890s, it had fallen below 60 cents per ounce. The decline had multiple causes. The Western mining boom greatly increased the global supply of silver. Germany's decision in 1871 to adopt the gold standard and sell off its silver reserves added to the supply flooding markets. Other European nations followed Germany's lead, reducing their use of silver in coinage. The result was a substantial and prolonged fall in silver's value relative to gold. This falling price had important economic effects, particularly for farmers in the American South and West who struggled with debt. When these farmers had borrowed money to buy land or equipment, they had taken on obligations denominated in dollars. If the currency were silver-based and silver were plentiful, the currency supply would expand, prices for crops would rise, and debts would become easier to repay. But with silver demonetized and the currency supply constrained by available gold, prices for agricultural commodities fell or stagnated while the debt burden remained fixed. A mortgage that had seemed manageable when wheat was $1 a bushel became crushing when wheat fell to 50 cents. The farmer saw silver coinage as a way to ease their burden. Silver miners, of course, had their own reasons to support silver coinage. If the government would purchase silver and coin it into dollars at the old ratio of 16 ounces of silver to 1 ounce of gold, the miners could receive far more for their silver than the market price. A miner with silver worth 60 cents per ounce on the open market could bring it to the mint and receive $1.29 worth of coin in exchange, assuming the old 16-to-1 ratio. This subsidy to silver producers would be borne by the general public through inflation as more currency entered circulation, but the benefits to miners would be immediate and tangible. The political alliance between Western silver interests and Southern and Western farmers created a powerful movement for silver coinage that would dominate American politics for the last quarter of the 19th century. The movement's demands were straightforward. Resume the free and unlimited coinage of silver at the ratio of 16 ounces of silver to 1 ounce of gold, restoring silver to its traditional role as money. This policy came to be known simply as free silver, and it inspired passionate advocacy from those who saw it as a solution to economic distress. Congress responded to the political pressure with compromise legislation. The Bland-Allison Act of 1878 required the Treasury to purchase between $2 million and $4 million worth of silver each month and coin it into silver dollars. This was far less than free silver advocates wanted. The purchases were limited and the coinage was not truly free, but it was more than gold standard supporters wished to concede. The silver dollars that resulted from this legislation, large heavy coins bearing the image of liberty on one side and an eagle on the other, were produced in large quantities. But they did not circulate widely. People preferred paper currency or gold for most transactions, and the silver dollars piled up in treasury vaults, coined, but largely unused. The Sherman Silver Purchase Act of 1890 went further, requiring the Treasury to purchase 4.5 million ounces of silver each month, nearly the entire domestic production. The government would pay for this silver with Treasury notes, a form of paper currency that was redeemable in either gold or silver at the government's discretion. This was an attempt to satisfy silver interest while maintaining the gold standard, but it created an unstable situation. Holders of the Treasury notes naturally preferred to redeem them for gold, since gold was worth more than silver on the market. The government's gold reserves began to decline as people exchanged silver-backed notes for gold coins. The strains in the system contributed to the Panic of 1893, a severe financial and economic crisis. The panic had multiple causes: overbuilding of railroads, excessive speculation, international financial problems, but the monetary uncertainty played a role. Foreign investors, worried about America's commitment to maintaining the gold standard given the large silver purchases, withdrew capital. Banks failed, unemployment rose, and the economy contracted sharply. President Grover Cleveland, a Democrat who believed firmly in the gold standard, called Congress into special session and demanded repeal of the Sherman Silver Purchase Act. After bitter debate, Congress complied in October of 1893, ending the government's obligation to purchase silver. But repealing the silver purchase requirement did not end the political controversy. The free silver movement, if anything, gained strength through the hard times of the 1890s as struggling farmers and workers sought explanations for their difficulties and solutions to their distress. The movement found its champion in William Jennings Bryan, a former congressman from Nebraska who was only 36 years old when he captured the Democratic presidential nomination in 1896. Bryan was a remarkable orator, gifted with a voice that could carry to the back of an outdoor crowd without amplification, and a talent for language that could move audiences to emotion. At the Democratic Convention in Chicago in July of 1896, Bryan delivered what would become one of the most famous speeches in American political history, defending free silver and attacking the gold standard with passionate conviction. The speech built to a peroration that delegates would remember for the rest of their lives. Bryan spoke of the farmers and workers, the producing classes who felt themselves crushed by monetary policy that favoured creditors over debtors, Eastern bankers over Western farmers. He declared that humanity should not be crucified upon a cross of gold, spreading his arms in a Christ-like pose as he finished. The convention erupted in wild approval, and Bryan won the nomination on the strength of that speech. The election of 1896 became a referendum on silver and the gold standard. Bryan travelled the country tirelessly, speaking sometimes dozens of times in a single day, carrying his message to every corner of the nation. His Republican opponent, William McKinley of Ohio, conducted a more traditional campaign from his home in Canton, receiving delegations who came to hear his defense of sound money and the gold standard. Business interests, frightened by Bryan and what his election might mean for the currency, poured unprecedented amounts of money into McKinley's campaign. McKinley won, though the margins were not overwhelming. He carried the industrial northeast and midwest, while Bryan swept the south and much of the agrarian west. Urban workers, despite Bryan's appeals to them as part of the producing classes, largely voted for McKinley, perhaps fearing that inflation would erode their wages more than it would ease their debts. The gold standard had survived its greatest political challenge, though it had been a near thing. Free silver would continue as a movement for several more years, with Bryan running again unsuccessfully in 1900. But its moment had passed. Even as the political battle raged, events were changing the underlying economics. New gold discoveries in South Africa, Alaska, and Australia greatly increased the world's gold supply in the 1890s and early 1900s. New refining techniques, particularly the cyanide process for extracting gold from low-grade ores, made previously uneconomical deposits profitable to mine. The gold supply was expanding just as silver advocates had wanted the silver supply to expand through coinage. The currency expansion that free silver supporters had sought, hoping to raise prices and ease debts, was happening anyway, through the natural increase in the gold stock. The debate over silver became less urgent as gold proved sufficient for the growing economy's needs. In March of 1900, Congress passed the Gold Standard Act, formally defining the dollar as 25 8/10 grains of gold 9/10 fine, which worked out to approximately $20.67 per ounce of pure gold. This was the ratio that had existed since 1834, now codified in law with silver officially relegated to a subsidiary role. The Act declared the gold dollar to be the standard unit of value and required all forms of money to be maintained at parity with gold. The question that had divided the nation for a quarter century was settled. The United States was officially on the gold standard. Silver's defeat as a monetary metal did not mean its story was over. The metal continued to be mined, continued to have value, continued to be used for various purposes, including some coinage. But its role had changed fundamentally. Silver was no longer the co-equal of gold, no longer the substance that many Americans believed should serve as the people's money. It had become, in monetary terms, a secondary metal, valued but no longer central to debates about national economic policy. The passionate political movement that had rallied around silver, that had elevated William Jennings Bryan to prominence and influenced American politics for decades, had run its course, closing a chapter in the long history of silver's relationship with human economic life. But new chapters awaited, in which silver would find different roles and different purposes, adapting as it always had to changing human needs and technologies. Silver's defeat as the basis for monetary expansion did not mean its complete departure from the nation's currency system. Even as the gold standard prevailed, silver continued to circulate in American pockets and to serve certain monetary functions, though in a diminished and carefully controlled way. The compromise that had been reached through the Bland-Allison Act and the Sherman Silver Purchase Act left a legacy. Millions of silver dollars sitting in treasury vaults, and a system of paper currency called silver certificates that represented claims on this metal. Silver certificates had been authorized by Congress in 1878 as part of the same legislation that required silver purchases. These were paper bills that could be presented to the Treasury for redemption in silver dollars or, later, in silver bullion. The notes declared on their face that they were redeemable in silver, distinguishing them from other forms of paper currency that made different promises. For Americans living in the early 20th century, silver certificates were a common and familiar form of money, used interchangeably with Federal Reserve notes and other paper currency for everyday transactions. The $1 silver certificate, with its distinctive blue seal and blue serial numbers, became particularly familiar to generations of Americans. The bills bore portraits of various historical figures over the years. George Washington appeared on many issues, as did Abraham Lincoln on the $5 certificates. But regardless of whose portrait graced the note, the essential promise remained the same. This paper represented silver, real silver, held by the government and available on demand to whoever held the note. Silver coins, meanwhile, continued to be produced in large quantities despite the gold standard. Dimes, quarters, and half-dollars were struck in 90% silver, meaning that 9 parts out of 10 of the coin's weight was pure silver, with the remainder being copper added for hardness and durability. These coins circulated widely, passing from hand to hand in countless daily transactions, worn gradually smooth by use. The silver dollar itself, that large coin that had been at the centre of so much political controversy, was produced sporadically, mainly for collectors, and for those few occasions when someone specifically requested one from a bank. The early 20th century brought new uses for silver that had little to do with coinage or currency. The most significant of these was photography. The photographic process, which had developed through the 19th century, relied on silver's unique chemical properties. Silver halide crystals, particularly silver bromide and silver chloride, have the remarkable quality of changing when exposed to light. These crystals, suspended in an emulsion coated on glass plates or film, would capture an image when light struck them. The exposed film could then be developed through chemical processes that converted the affected silver halides into metallic silver, creating a visible image. Photography was, at its heart, a process of manipulating silver through light and chemistry. As photography became more common, moving from specialized studios to amateur snapshots, the demand for silver increased. Every photograph required silver, a small amount to be sure, but the cumulative effect of millions and eventually billions of photographs represented significant silver consumption. By the middle of the 20th century, photography would account for a substantial portion of annual silver usage, connecting the metal to family memories, artistic expression, journalism, and scientific research. The First World War, that great catastrophe that engulfed Europe from 1914 to 1918, had important effects on silver's role and value. The war created enormous demand for metals of all kinds, including silver. Silver was used in electrical contacts and bearings, in mirrors for searchlights, in various military applications. The United States, which entered the war in 1917, needed to mobilize its resources, including its silver. The Pittman Act of 1918 authorized the melting of silver dollars from the Treasury's hoards and the sale of the resulting bullion, primarily to Britain, which needed silver for its trade with India. The Act also required the government to repurchase silver later to replace what had been melted, a provision that would benefit Western silver miners. The Pittman Act demonstrated that silver, even if no longer central to monetary debates, retained strategic importance. Governments hoarded it, not just as potential money, but as a useful industrial material and a store of value in uncertain times. The Act also showed that the vast quantities of silver dollars sitting in treasury vaults could be mobilized when national needs required it, that these coins were not merely relics of past political battles, but resources that could be drawn upon. Through the 1920s and into the 1930s, silver continued in its dual role as both monetary metal and industrial commodity. The price fluctuated with supply and demand, rising when industrial uses increased or mining production declined, falling when the opposite occurred. The Great Depression that began in 1929 affected silver as it did everything else, reducing industrial demand and driving prices down. Silver miners, already struggling with prices that had never recovered to their pre-1893 levels, faced new hardships. President Franklin Roosevelt's policies during the Depression included measures to support silver prices, partly for economic reasons and partly for political ones. Western states with silver mining interest had political influence, and supporting silver prices meant supporting those states' economies. The Silver Purchase Act of 1934 required the Treasury to buy silver until either the price reached $1.29 per ounce, or silver comprised 1/4 of the monetary reserves backing the currency. The Act never quite achieved its stated goals, but it did put substantial quantities of silver into Treasury vaults and provided support for silver prices through the government's purchasing program. The silver that the Treasury acquired under the 1934 Act and subsequent purchases gradually accumulated into an enormous strategic stockpile. By the 1940s, the government held more than 2 billion ounces of silver, much of it stored in deep underground vaults where it sat, bar after bar stacked in neat rows, representing wealth held in reserve. This silver backed the silver certificates that circulated as currency, but there was far more silver than would ever be needed to redeem the paper. The surplus represented a strategic reserve, a resource that could be drawn upon if needed for industrial purposes or sold if the government needed revenue. The Second World War, like the First, increased industrial demand for silver. Electronics, which had been developing rapidly since the early 20th century, required silver for various components. Silver's excellent electrical conductivity made it valuable for switches, contacts, and other electrical applications. The Manhattan Project, the secret effort to develop atomic weapons, used significant quantities of silver borrowed from the Treasury for winding magnets in the uranium enrichment process. Thousands of tons of silver, transformed temporarily into electromagnets, helped produce the uranium that would fuel the first atomic bombs. After the war, this silver was returned to the Treasury, its brief service in one of history's most consequential scientific projects leaving no lasting mark on the metal itself. Through the 1940s and 50s, silver remained a familiar part of American life. Children received silver coins as allowances. Coins jingled in pockets with a distinctive sound that the metal's density created. The connection between the physical silver in the coins and the abstract monetary value they represented was tangible, something you could feel in your hand. A quarter contained roughly 18/100ths of an ounce of silver, enough to give the coin genuine heft and substance. The silver in American coinage represented a link to earlier times, when money had been inseparable from precious metals. But maintaining silver coinage was becoming increasingly problematic. As industrial demand for silver grew and mining production failed to keep pace, silver prices edged upward. By the early 1960s, the market price of silver was approaching the level where the metal in a silver coin would be worth as much as the coin's face value. This created an obvious problem. If a dime contained 10 cents worth of silver, there was no reason for anyone to spend the dime. It was worth more melted down than as money. The inevitable result would be that silver coins would disappear from circulation, hoarded or melted, leaving the economy without adequate small change. President John F. Kennedy addressed this problem in a special message to Congress in 1961. He acknowledged that the supply of silver was not keeping pace with the needs of the coinage, and he proposed measures to stretch the existing silver supply while searching for alternatives. Kennedy's message was carefully worded, recognizing the traditional and emotional attachment many Americans felt towards silver coinage, while accepting the practical reality that change would eventually be necessary. The president did not live to see the full resolution of the silver coinage question, but his administration began the process of preparing for a transition. The pressure on silver supplies continued to build through the early 1960s. Industrial demand kept growing as electronics proliferated, and photography reached its peak as a consumer and professional medium. The Treasury's silver stockpile, accumulated through decades of purchases, was being drawn down to meet various obligations. Silver certificates were still redeemable in silver, and some people began redeeming them, recognizing that the silver was becoming more valuable. the government faced a dilemma: continue using silver in coinage and risk running out, or change the coinage and face political resistance from those who valued silver coins. In 1965, Congress passed the Coinage Act, which fundamentally changed American money. The act eliminated silver entirely from dimes and quarters, replacing it with a copper-nickel-clad composition that looked similar to silver but contained no precious metal. The coins would have a copper core sandwiched between layers of copper-nickel alloy, giving them the silvery appearance that people expected, while reducing their intrinsic value to far less than their face value. Half dollars would continue to contain silver, but reduced from 90% to 40%, a compromise that maintained some silver content while stretching supplies. President Lyndon Johnson signed the Coinage Act into law on July 23, 1965, in a ceremony that emphasized continuity as much as change. Johnson noted that the new coins would look, feel, and spend the same as the old silver coins, that Americans would hardly notice the difference in everyday use. This was partly true. The new clad coins did look similar to their silver predecessors, at least at first glance. But those who handled money regularly, who felt coins in their fingers every day, could detect the difference. The new coins sounded different when dropped, felt different in weight and texture, lacked the particular quality that silver imparted. The disappearance of silver from circulating coinage marked the end of a tradition that stretched back thousands of years. For the first time in history, American coins contain no precious metal, deriving their value entirely from government fiat rather than from the substance they were made of. It was a profound change, though it happened with little disruption to daily economic life. People continued to use coins as they always had, accepting them in payment, making change, dropping them in parking meters and vending machines. The system worked, demonstrating that money did not need to be made of precious metal to function, that trust and habit were more important than intrinsic value. Silver certificates were gradually phased out as well. In 1968, the government stopped redeeming silver certificates for silver, ending the last direct connection between American paper currency and the metal. Existing silver certificates remained legal tender, continued to circulate, but they were now just paper, no different in substance from Federal Reserve notes. The blue seal that had marked them as special became merely decorative, a reminder of what had once been rather than a current promise. Over time, silver certificates were withdrawn from circulation as they wore out, replaced by the uniform green-sealed Federal Reserve notes that became the sole paper currency Americans carried. The 40% silver half dollars continued to be produced through 1970, but in decreasing quantities as the Treasury worked through its remaining silver stocks. After 1970, half dollars were struck in the same copper-nickel-clad composition as the smaller coins, completing silver's removal from circulating coinage. Special silver coins were produced for collectors, commemoratives, and proof sets, maintaining a market for those who wanted to own silver coins, even if such coins no longer passed from hand to hand in commerce. Silver, freed from its monetary role, found its value determined increasingly by industrial demand. Electronics required silver for switches, contacts, and connectors. The developing aerospace industry used silver in various applications. Medical researchers discovered that silver had antibacterial properties, leading to its use in wound dressings and certain medical devices. Silver's unique combination of electrical and thermal conductivity, resistance to corrosion, and workability made it valuable for countless specialized applications. The metal that had once been prized primarily as money was now valued primarily for what it could do in industry and technology. Photography remained silver's largest single use through much of the late 20th century. Every roll of film, every photographic print required silver. The quantity per image was small, measured in milligrams, but the cumulative demand from billions of photographs worldwide consumed hundreds of millions of ounces of silver annually. Professional photography, medical X-rays, motion pictures, amateur snapshots, all depended on silver's light-sensitive properties. The silver was in some sense temporary, as much of it could be recovered from used film and photographic solutions through recycling, but the continuous flow of silver through the photographic industry represented a major component of silver's economic importance. The transition from silver as money to silver as industrial metal was not dramatic or sudden. It unfolded over decades, a gradual shift in emphasis rather than a sharp break. Even after silver left circulating coinage, people continued to think of it as a precious metal, something valuable and worth saving. Silver coins from before 1965 were hoarded, sorted out from newer coins and set aside, their silver content making them worth more than face value. This created a quiet parallel economy of silver coins, traded between collectors and those who valued silver, priced based on the metal content rather than the monetary denomination stamped on them. The story of silver in the 20th century is one of adaptation, of a metal that had been central to monetary systems for millennia, finding new purposes as those systems evolved. Silver remained valuable, remained useful, remained desired, but its role has changed. It was no longer the substance of everyday money, no longer the common medium through which people exchange value in routine transactions. Instead, it had become a specialized industrial material, a commodity traded in markets, a collector's item, and still, to some degree, a store of value for those who believed in holding tangible assets. The metal's journey was far from over, but it had entered a new phase, one in which its chemical and physical properties mattered more than its historical role as the companion to gold in humanity's monetary imagination. Silver's evolution from monetary metal to industrial commodity did not mean it ceased to be an object of speculation or investment. Throughout the 1970s, as the monetary system adjusted to floating exchange rates and the end of gold's official role, some observers looked to precious metals as stores of value in uncertain times. Inflation was rising, driven by oil shocks and loose monetary policy. The dollar, no longer anchored to gold, seemed vulnerable to erosion. In this environment, silver attracted attention from investors seeking assets that would hold value as paper currency depreciated. Among those who developed an interest in silver were two brothers from Texas, Nelson Bunker Hunt and William Herbert Hunt. The Hunt family had accumulated enormous wealth through oil exploration and production, and Bunker and Herbert, as they were known, had inherited both fortune and an inclination toward ambitious investment strategies. They were not professional traders or financiers, but wealthy individuals willing to commit substantial resources to ideas they believed in, and they came to believe in silver. The Hunt brothers' interest in silver developed gradually through the 1970s. They observed inflation eroding the value of paper assets and sought tangible stores of value. Silver appealed to them for several reasons. It was cheaper than gold, which made it possible to accumulate large quantities. It had industrial uses that created steady demand, and there was a limited amount of it available, at least in forms that could be easily traded or delivered. If one could acquire enough silver, and if others followed in recognizing its value, the price might rise substantially. The logic was straightforward, the kind of reasoning that has motivated commodity investors throughout history. The Hunts began purchasing silver in 1973, initially in relatively modest quantities. They bought physical silver, actual bars of metal that were delivered to warehouses where they could be stored. They also began purchasing silver futures contracts, agreements to buy silver at specific prices for delivery at future dates. Futures contracts allowed them to control far more silver than they could afford to purchase outright, using leverage to amplify their position. As the 1970s progressed, their purchases grew larger and more systematic. By the late 1970s, the Hunt brothers had accumulated an extraordinary position in silver. They owned tens of millions of ounces of physical metal, stored in vaults in New York, Chicago, and overseas. They controlled hundreds of millions of ounces through futures contracts. Other investors and traders, recognizing that the Hunts were accumulating silver, began to follow their lead, pushing prices higher. What had started as a personal investment strategy was beginning to affect the broader silver market in noticeable ways. The price of silver, which had been around $2 per ounce in the mid-1970s, began to rise as the decade progressed. By 1979, it was approaching $6 per ounce, a level that seemed high by historical standards, but that would prove to be merely the beginning. The acceleration came in the latter part of 1979 and into early 1980, as the Hunt brothers continued their purchases and as broader inflation fears drove more investors toward precious metals. Silver was not the only asset rising, gold was surging as well, along with other commodities. But silver's increase was particularly dramatic. From $6 per ounce in early 1979, silver climbed steadily through the year. $10 per ounce, $15, $20. The rise gathered momentum as it progressed, each new high attracting more attention, more buyers, more conviction that silver was heading higher still. By late December 1979, silver had reached $30 per ounce, a price that seemed almost incredible to those who remembered when it had traded for little more than $1. But the rise was not finished. In early January 1980, silver surged past $40 per ounce. On January 21st, it touched $49.45, a level that represented an increase of more than 700% in less than a year. Those who had purchased silver early in the rise had seen their investments multiply many times over. The Hunt brothers, who had started accumulating when prices were far lower, held positions that were worth billions of dollars, at least on paper. It was one of the great bull markets in commodity history, and it appeared unstoppable. But markets have a way of correcting excesses, and the silver market was approaching a point where various forces would combine to reverse the rise. The exchanges where silver futures were traded, particularly the commodity exchange in New York, known as COMEX, became concerned about the concentration of positions and the potential for manipulation. In January 1980, COMEX implemented new rules, collectively known as Silver Rule 7, that place strict limits on the number of futures contracts any single entity could hold. The intent was to prevent any individual or group from dominating the market or forcing a squeeze where short sellers would be unable to deliver silver they had contracted to sell. The rule changes made it more difficult for the Hunt brothers to maintain their strategy. They could no longer accumulate unlimited futures positions, and the contracts they held would require ever larger margin deposits as the exchange raised margin requirements. Margin is money that must be deposited to secure a futures position, serving as collateral against potential losses. When prices are rising, margin requirements tend to rise as well, as exchanges seek to protect themselves against the risk that positions will go bad and holders will be unable to cover their obligations. Through February and into March 1980, silver prices began to weaken. The new rules had disrupted the buying pressure that had driven the market higher. Some investors, having watched silver multiply in value, decided to take profits, selling at prices they could scarcely believe. Short sellers, who had bet against silver by selling contracts they did not own, began to gain confidence that the market had peaked. The rise paused, then began to reverse. The reversal accelerated on Thursday, March 27, 1980, a day that would be remembered as Silver Thursday. The price of silver fell sharply, declining from around $21 per ounce at the start of the day to just over $10 by the close. The drop was precipitous, one of the largest single-day declines in any commodity market, and it triggered cascading effects throughout the financial system. The Hunt brothers, who'd been spectacularly wealthy on paper just weeks earlier, suddenly faced enormous losses. Their positions, leveraged through futures contracts, had turned against them dramatically. The problem extended beyond the Hunts themselves. Batch Halsey Stewart Shields, a major brokerage firm that had handled much of the Hunts' silver trading, found itself exposed to losses if the Hunts could not meet their margin calls. Bash had lent money to the Hunts, accepting silver as collateral, and as silver prices collapsed, the collateral was worth far less than the loans. The firm faced the possibility of catastrophic losses, potentially enough to threaten its survival. And if Bash failed, the effects could spread to other firms and to the broader financial system, creating a chain of failures similar to what had occurred in past financial panics. The Federal Reserve, the nation's central bank, watched the situation with concern. Paul Volcker, who had become chairman of the Federal Reserve in August 1979, was focused primarily on fighting inflation, but he could not ignore a potential financial crisis. The Fed worked with regulators and other banks to arrange emergency credit for the troubled parties, helping to prevent what might have become a systemic breakdown. A consortium of banks provided Batch with a loan of $100 million to stabilize the firm. Separately, arrangements were made to extend credit to the Hunts, allowing them to meet immediate obligations while longer-term solutions were negotiated. The intervention succeeded in preventing immediate collapse, but it left difficult questions. The Hunt brothers had engaged in speculation on an enormous scale, using borrowed money to amplify their bets, and their speculation had nearly brought down financial institutions. Should they be allowed to fail, suffering the full consequences of their miscalculation? Or did the potential effects on the broader financial system justify intervention to prevent cascading failures? These questions would be debated in congressional hearings and in the financial press, echoing similar debates from earlier crises and foreshadowing debates that would recur in future financial troubles. The Hunt brothers did not escape unscathed. They eventually had to liquidate much of their silver holdings at prices far below what they had paid, Their broader financial empire, built on oil wealth, came under strain as lenders who had been happy to extend credit when the hunt seemed invincible became cautious or hostile. Legal proceedings followed, with investigations into whether market manipulation had occurred and civil suits seeking damages. The brothers filed for bankruptcy in 1988, a remarkable reversal of fortune for men who had once been among the wealthiest in America. They eventually settled various claims, paying $10 million to resolve accusations that they had attempted to manipulate the market. The silver market itself eventually stabilized, finding levels that reflected genuine supply and demand rather than speculative excess. Silver traded in the $10 to $15 per ounce range through much of the 1980s, occasionally dipping lower, occasionally spiking higher, but never approaching the peaks of early 1980. The episode became a cautionary tale, studied by those interested in commodity markets and financial speculation. It illustrated how even enormous wealth could be insufficient to control a market indefinitely, how exchanges could change rules to prevent manipulation, how leverage magnified both gains and losses, and how speculative excess eventually corrected itself. For those who held silver as a long-term store of value rather than as a speculative vehicle, the episode was disturbing but ultimately did not change the fundamental calculation. Silver still had industrial uses, still had a limited supply, still held value. The price volatility was unpleasant, but those who believed in holding tangible assets could simply wait for the market to settle and resume serving its more mundane functions. The silver itself remained unchanged, the same lustrous metal it had always been, waiting patiently in vaults for the cycles of speculation to pass. The Hunt brothers' attempt to corner the silver market revealed something about the nature of commodities and markets. Unlike stocks or bonds, where the supply is essentially fixed at any given moment, physical commodities can be produced if prices rise high enough. When silver reached $50 per ounce, mining companies reopened old mines that had been uneconomical at lower prices. Holders of silver jewellery and silverware began to sell, taking advantage of prices that made their silver worth far more melted down than as objects. Industrial users found substitutes where possible, reducing demand. All of these responses, individually modest but collectively powerful, increased supply and decreased demand, creating forces that would eventually overwhelm any attempt to push prices ever higher. The episode also demonstrated the role of organized exchanges in maintaining orderly markets. COMEX's decision to change position limits and raise margin requirements, while controversial and challenged legally by the Hunts, prevented the situation from becoming even more extreme. If the Hunt brothers had been able to continue accumulating unlimited positions, if short sellers had been forced into an impossible squeeze, the disruption could have been far more severe. The exchange rules, though they might seem to favour certain participants over others, served a broader function of preventing markets from being dominated by single players in ways that could undermine confidence in the market's fairness. For silver itself, the 1980 episode was a dramatic but temporary disruption. The metal's long-term value depended on its industrial usefulness, its relative scarcity, and the continued human tendency to value precious metals as stores of wealth. These fundamentals had not changed because two brothers from Texas had attempted to corner the market. Silver would continue to be mined, refined, used in countless applications, and held by investors who believed in its enduring worth. The price would fluctuate, as commodity prices always do, rising and falling with a complex interplay of supply, demand, and human psychology. But the metal itself remained, constant and patient, ready to serve whatever purposes humans found for it. The story of the Hunt brothers and silver is often told as a tale of hubris and comeuppance, of wealthy men who overreached and paid the price. But perhaps it is better understood as an episode in the ongoing relationship between humans and this particular metal, a moment when speculation briefly dominated but could not permanently control a market with fundamental uses and limits. The silver that had once flowed from Potosí to China, that had circulated as coins in ancient Athens and medieval Europe, that had served as the basis for monetary debates in the 1890s, had now shown that it could also be the subject of modern speculation and market dynamics. Through it all, silver remained what it had always been, a metal with unique properties, valued across centuries, adapting to whatever roles humans assigned to it while maintaining its essential character, that cool, lustrous substance that catches light with its particular gentle gleam. The silver market that emerged from the turbulence of 1980 settled into patterns that reflected the metal's changing role in the modern economy. Through the 1980s and 90s, silver functioned primarily as an industrial commodity, its price determined by the prosaic calculations of supply and demand rather than by speculation or monetary policy. The metal found its way into an ever-growing array of applications, each individually modest but collectively substantial, as technology advanced and new uses for silver's unique properties were discovered. Photography remained silver's largest single consumer through the closing decades of the 20th century. The industry had grown enormously since silver's light-sensitive properties were first harnessed in the 1800s. Professional photographers, photojournalists, portrait studios, medical facilities taking X-rays, amateur photographers capturing family memories all relied on silver-based film and paper. The worldwide consumption of silver for photography peaked around 1999 at approximately 267 million ounces annually, a staggering quantity that represented roughly 1/3 of all silver used each year. But even as photographic silver consumption reached its peak, the technology that would eventually replace it was already developing. Digital photography, which captured images using electronic sensors rather than silver-based film, had been advancing steadily since the 1970s and 80s. Early digital cameras were expensive, produced images of inferior quality compared to film, and appealed primarily to professionals with specialized needs. But the technology improved with remarkable speed, following the broader patterns of advancement in electronics and computing. Digital cameras became smaller, cheaper, and more capable with each generation. The transition from film to digital photography unfolded gradually through the 1990s and accelerated dramatically in the 2000s. Each year, more consumers chose digital cameras over film, attracted by the convenience of instant results, the ability to take unlimited photos without buying film, and the ease of sharing images electronically. Professional photographers resisted longer, valuing the aesthetic qualities of film and the established workflows of traditional photography. But even they eventually conceded that digital technology had matched or exceeded film's capabilities for most purposes. By 2010, film photography had become a niche practice, maintained by enthusiasts and artists who valued its particular qualities, but abandoned by the mass market. The effect on silver demand was profound. From the peak of 267 million ounces in 1999, photographic silver consumption fell steadily, declining to perhaps 150 million ounces by 2005 to 75 million ounces by 2010, and to just 30 million ounces by 2018. In less than 2 decades, silver lost its largest single use, as billions of photographs that once would have required silver were instead captured by digital sensors that use no silver at all. It was a remarkable transformation, the kind of technological disruption that changes industries and eliminates long-standing patterns of resource consumption. Yet even as photography's demand for silver collapsed, other uses were emerging and expanding. The electronics industry, which had used silver in specialized applications for decades, found ever more ways to exploit the metal's properties. Silver is the best conductor of electricity among all metals, better even than copper or gold. This makes it valuable for any application where electrical resistance must be minimized or where reliability is crucial. Switches, contacts, and connectors in demanding applications often used silver or silver alloys. The quantities per device were tiny, a few grams or even less, but with billions of electronic devices being produced annually, the cumulative demand was substantial. Solar panels, which convert sunlight into electricity, emerged as a significant and growing consumer of silver. The technology had existed in rudimentary form since the 1950s, but solar power remained expensive and impractical for most applications until improvements in efficiency and manufacturing costs made it increasingly competitive with conventional electricity generation. A solar panel uses silver in the form of a paste that is screen-printed onto silicon wafers to form the electrical contacts that collect and conduct the current generated by the solar cell. Each panel contains only a small amount of silver, perhaps 20 grams or so, but as solar installations proliferated across rooftops and in utility-scale solar farms, the demand grew. By the 2010s, solar panels were consuming perhaps 50 million ounces of silver annually, and the quantity was projected to rise as solar power continued its rapid expansion. Some estimates suggested that solar could eventually consume 100 million ounces per year or more, potentially replacing photography as silver's largest single use. The irony was not lost on observers. Silver, which had captured light through photographic chemistry, was now helping to convert light into electrical power through photovoltaic technology. The metal's relationship with light, it seemed, continued in a new form. The early 2000s also saw the development of new financial products that allowed investors to gain exposure to silver without the complications of storing physical metal. In 2006, Barclays launched the iShares Silver Trust, an exchange-traded fund that held physical silver and issued shares representing ownership in that silver. Investors could buy shares of the trust as easily as buying stock, and the value of each share tracked the price of silver. The trust held its silver in secure vaults, professionally managed and regularly audited, providing investors with the security of physical silver ownership without the logistical challenges of actually taking possession of bars or coins. The iShares Silver Trust and similar vehicles that followed made it far easier for a broader range of investors to include silver in their portfolios. A person with a few $1,000s to invest could now gain silver exposure simply by purchasing shares through a brokerage account without worrying about storage, insurance, or the premiums that dealers charged for physical silver products. The trust grew rapidly, accumulating hundreds of millions of ounces of silver within a few years of its launch. This silver was held in vaults on behalf of shareholders, removed from the market in a sense but always ready to be sold if investors chose to exit their positions. Silver prices through the early 2000s ranged generally between $5 and $10 per ounce, levels that seemed reasonable given the supply-demand balance. But as the decade progressed, a combination of factors began pushing prices higher. The financial crisis of 2008 created enormous uncertainty about the stability of the financial system and the future value of paper assets. Central banks responded with unprecedented monetary stimulus, creating new money in vast quantities to prevent economic collapse. Some investors worried that this monetary expansion would lead to inflation or even currency debasement, and they sought protection in tangible assets like precious metals. Gold surged to new highs, exceeding $1,000 per ounce in 2008 and continuing higher in subsequent years. Silver followed, though its path was more volatile. The silver market, smaller than gold's, tended to amplify movements in either direction. From around $9 per ounce at the end of 2008, silver rose steadily through 2009 and 2010. By early 2011, it was approaching $30 per ounce, levels not seen since the Hunt brothers era. The rise continued into the spring of 2011. On April 28th of that year, silver touched $48.70 per ounce, its highest price since the $50 peak of January 1980. Some investors who had bought silver earlier in the decade saw their holdings triple or quadruple in value. The rally drew enormous attention, with financial media discussing silver daily and predicting how high it might go. Some enthusiasts suggested that silver was grossly undervalued, that it should be worth far more than its price, that much higher levels were inevitable. But as had happened in 1980, the peak proved unsustainable. Silver prices began falling in May 2011, declining sharply over subsequent weeks. By late summer, silver had fallen back below $30 per ounce. The decline continued more gradually over the following years. By 2015, silver was trading in the $14 to $16 range, less than one-third of the 2011 peak. Those who had purchased near the top, expecting further gains, suffered substantial losses. Those who had held silver as a long-term store of value simply accepted the volatility as part of precious metals ownership, neither surprised by the decline nor particularly distressed by it. The relationship between silver and gold prices, expressed as the gold-to-silver ratio, attracted attention from market observers who saw patterns in how the two metals moved relative to each other. Historically, through much of human history, silver had traded at ratios ranging from about 10 to 1 to perhaps 16 to 1 relative to gold, meaning that 10 to 16 ounces of silver would exchange for 1 ounce of gold. This reflected the metal's relative scarcity and the fact that both served monetary roles. But as silver lost its monetary function and became primarily an industrial metal, while gold retained its status as the ultimate monetary metal and store of value, the ratio drifted higher. By the 2010s, the gold-to-silver ratio fluctuated typically between 50 to 1 and 70 to 1, occasionally moving outside this range during periods of particular stress or calm. In March 2020, as the COVID-19 pandemic disrupted markets worldwide, the ratio spiked above 120 to 1, an extreme level that reflected silver's industrial demand collapsing while gold maintained its value as a safe haven. The ratio subsequently fell back, but it remained elevated compared to historical norms, reflecting silver's changed role in the modern economy. Some investors who believed in mean reversion bought silver when the ratio was high, betting that silver would eventually catch up to gold. Others simply noted the ratio as one more data point in understanding the complex factors that determined precious metal prices. The production of silver from mines had its own distinctive character in the modern era. Unlike in earlier centuries when mining operations specifically targeted silver deposits, most silver in the late 20th and early 21st centuries came as a byproduct of mining other metals. Perhaps 70% of newly mined silver came from operations primarily extracting copper, lead, zinc, or gold, with silver as a secondary or tertiary product. This meant that silver production was largely determined by the economics of these other metals rather than by silver prices alone. Even if silver prices rose substantially, production would not necessarily increase quickly, since the mining companies were making their decisions based primarily on copper, or gold, or zinc markets. Global silver production from mining operations stabilized at roughly 25,000 metric tons per year in the early 21st century, equivalent to about 800 million ounces. Mexico was the largest producing country, followed by Peru, China, and various other nations with significant mining industries. The silver came from countless mines, from enormous open-pit operations to underground facilities, extracted from ores of varying richness and processed through smelters and refineries to produce the pure metal. From these sources, silver flowed into the global market, meeting the demands of industry, investment, and the remaining uses in jewelry, silverware, and coinage. Recycling provided a secondary source of silver, recovering metal from discarded electronics, photographic waste, and used products. The recycling rate for silver, however, was considerably lower than for gold. Perhaps 15 to 20% of silver demand was met through recycling, compared to perhaps 30% for gold. The difference reflected silver's more dispersed uses. Gold, concentrated in jewelry and investment products, was relatively easy to recover and recycle. Silver, spread through countless electronic devices and industrial applications in small quantities, was more difficult to collect and process economically. As electronics waste grew, efforts to improve silver recovery from discarded devices increased, but the dispersed nature of silver's uses remained a challenge. The automotive industry, long consumer of silver for electrical contacts and other components, found new uses for the metal in the emerging electric vehicle sector. Electric vehicles, which began to see significant adoption in the 2010s, used more silver than conventional vehicles. Each electric vehicle might contain 25 to 50 grams of silver in various components. More than a conventional car, but still a relatively modest amount. But as electric vehicle production ramped up, aiming toward millions of units annually and potentially tens of millions as the technology matured, the cumulative silver demand became significant. Some analysts projected that electric vehicles could eventually consume 50 million ounces of silver annually or more, adding to the metal's industrial demand profile. Medical applications for silver, based on its antibacterial properties, also expanded in the modern era. Silver ions can disrupt bacterial cell walls and interfere with bacterial metabolism, making the metal effective at preventing bacterial growth This property had been recognized for centuries, but was increasingly exploited in modern medical products. Wound dressings containing silver helped prevent infections. Certain catheters and medical devices were coated with silver to reduce the risk of healthcare-associated infections. The quantities involved were small, but the applications were valuable, representing another way that silver's unique properties found practical use in addressing human needs. Silver's role in water purification and air treatment also developed, as the metal's antibacterial properties could be harnessed to prevent bacterial and algal growth in water systems or to purify air in specialized applications. These uses remained relatively small compared to electronics or solar panels, but they represented the continuing discovery of ways to exploit silver's characteristics. Each new application, each new technology that found silver useful, added to the complex web of demand that determined the metal's value in the modern economy. Through all these changes and developments, silver maintained its dual identity as both industrial commodity and investment asset. Industrial users needed silver for its properties and would continue using it as long as no better substitute emerged for their specific applications. Investors held silver as a hedge against inflation, currency debasement, or financial instability, believing that tangible assets would retain value when paper assets might not. These two sources of demand, industrial and investment, sometimes reinforced each other and sometimes worked at cross purposes, creating the price volatility that characterized silver markets. The silver held in vaults by the various exchange-traded funds, by individuals in safe deposit boxes, by dealers in their inventories, represented what some analysts called the above-ground silver supply. Estimates of this supply varied considerably, but perhaps 2 to 3 billion ounces existed in identifiable investable forms. This was far less than the cumulative silver that had been mined over human history, as much of that silver had been consumed in industrial uses that dispersed it in ways that made recovery impractical. The relatively limited above-ground supply meant that significant shifts in investment demand could move prices substantially, since there was only so much readily available silver that could be bought or sold. As the 21st century progressed into its second and third decades, silver found itself in a curious position. It was no longer money, no longer the substance of coins that passed from hand to hand. It had been displaced in photography, once its largest use, by digital technology that required no silver at all. Yet it remained valuable, perhaps more valuable than ever in absolute terms if not relative to gold, supported by its continuing industrial usefulness and by the persistent human inclination to hold tangible assets. The metal adapted, as it had always adapted, to the changing needs and technologies of human society, finding new roles even as old ones disappeared, maintaining its relevance through sheer versatility and utility. To understand silver's enduring value and its potential future roles, it helps to consider what silver actually is, the physical and chemical properties that make this particular element useful for so many purposes. Silver is element 47 on the periodic table, sitting between palladium and cadmium, a transition metal with characteristics that make it unique among all the elements. Its atomic structure gives it properties that no other substance quite matches, a combination of qualities that explains why humans have valued it for millennia and why it remains relevant in the age of advanced technology. Silver's most notable property is its electrical conductivity. Among all metals, among all substances known to science, silver conducts electricity better than anything else. Copper comes close and is more commonly used because it is cheaper, but silver's conductivity exceeds even copper's by about 5%. For applications where that extra conductivity matters, where efficiency is crucial, or where reliability cannot be compromised, silver becomes the material of choice. Spacecraft, military equipment, high-end audio systems, specialized medical devices. These and many other applications use silver precisely because that superior conductivity can make a meaningful difference. Silver also conducts heat exceptionally well, better than any other metal. This thermal conductivity makes silver valuable in applications that require rapid heat dissipation or precise temperature control. Electronics generate heat as they operate, and managing that heat is essential for reliability and longevity. Silver's ability to conduct heat away from sensitive components, combined with its electrical properties, makes it doubly useful in electronic applications. The metal serves both to carry electrical current and to manage the heat that current generates, a dual functionality that few other materials can match. The metal's reflectivity is another distinctive characteristic. Silver reflects light across the visible spectrum and into the infrared more efficiently than almost any other substance. A properly prepared silver surface can reflect more than 95% of the light that strikes it, making silver the material of choice for high-quality mirrors. Telescopes use silver-coated mirrors to gather light from distant stars and galaxies. Solar concentrators use silver-coated reflectors to focus sunlight for power generation. Even everyday mirrors often use silver, though aluminum is more common for less demanding applications. The metal's ability to bounce light with minimal loss has made it essential for optical applications throughout the development of modern science and technology. Silver also possesses antimicrobial properties that set it apart from most other metals. Silver ions interfere with bacterial cellular functions in multiple ways, disrupting cell walls, binding to proteins, and interfering with DNA replication. This makes silver effective at killing or preventing the growth of a wide range of bacteria and some other microorganisms. The mechanism of silver's antimicrobial action is complex and not entirely understood, but the effect is well documented and has been exploited for centuries. Water stored in silver vessels tends to stay cleaner. Wounds treated with silver compounds are less likely to become infected. Modern medical research has refined and expanded these ancient observations, creating silver-based products that help address the persistent challenge of bacterial infection. Understanding silver's properties helps explain its uses, but to understand its availability, one must look to geology and geochemistry. Silver is not particularly rare in the Earth's crust. Estimates suggest that silver occurs at a concentration of roughly 75 parts per billion in the crust, making it about 19 times more common than gold. If abundance alone determined value, silver would be worth far less relative to gold than it actually is. But accessibility matters more than absolute abundance. Silver deposits concentrated enough to mine economically are much rarer than the dispersed background concentration. Finding and extracting silver requires geological processes that concentrate it from its natural distribution, creating the ore bodies that make mining worthwhile. Silver commonly occurs in association with other metals, particularly copper, lead, and zinc. The geological processes that create these base metal deposits often also concentrate silver, which is why so much silver is produced as a byproduct of mining these other metals. Pure silver deposits exist and are mined specifically for silver, but they are less common. The economics of silver production thus depend partly on the demand for copper, lead, and zinc, linking silver's supply to broader industrial metal markets in ways that make production less responsive to silver prices alone than might otherwise be the case. The amount of silver that exists in refined, above-ground forms has accumulated over human history as mining has extracted the metal from the earth. Estimates of this above-ground supply vary, reflecting the difficulty of accounting for all the silver in jewellery, silverware, industrial applications, and investment holdings worldwide. A reasonable estimate might place the above-ground supply at 2 to 3 billion ounces, equivalent to perhaps 60 to 90,000 metric tons. This is far less than gold's above-ground supply relative to the mining production of both metals, reflecting silver's consumption in industrial uses that disperse it in ways that make recovery difficult. Recycling recovers some of the silver from products that have reached the end of their useful lives. Old electronics, photographic waste, used catalysts, silverware, all can be processed to recover their silver content. But silver's recycling rate is lower than gold's, perhaps 15 to 20% of annual supply, compared to roughly 30% for gold. The difference reflects how the metals are used. Gold is concentrated in jewellery and investment products like coins and bars, forms that make recovery straightforward and economical. Silver is spread through countless applications, often in small quantities mixed with other materials, making recovery more challenging. A circuit board might contain a few milligrams of silver, a solar panel a few grams. Collecting enough of these dispersed applications and economically extracting the silver requires infrastructure and processes that do not always exist, or that may not be profitable at prevailing silver prices. Looking forward, silver's role in emerging technologies appears substantial. The transition toward renewable energy sources, driven by concerns about climate change and by the declining costs of solar and wind power, creates increasing demand for silver. Solar panels, as we have seen, use silver in their electrical contacts, and as solar capacity expands globally, silver consumption for this purpose grows correspondingly. Some analysts project that solar panels could consume well over 100 million ounces of silver annually within a decade or two, if solar deployment continues at current or accelerated rates. Efforts to reduce the amount of silver required per panel are ongoing, with researchers developing techniques that use less silver while maintaining efficiency. But even with these improvements, total demand is likely to remain significant. The fifth generation of cellular network technology, commonly called 5G, requires more sophisticated antennas and electronic components than earlier generations. These components often use silver for its superior electrical properties, as the higher frequencies and data rates of 5G benefit from materials that minimize signal loss. As 5G networks expand globally, as billions of devices connect to these networks, the cumulative silver demand, though measured in small quantities per device, adds up. Each new generation of technology, each increase in complexity and performance requirements, tends to find uses for silver's exceptional properties. Medical applications for silver continue to develop as researchers better understand the metal's antimicrobial mechanisms and as the challenge of antibiotic-resistant bacteria grows more pressing. Silver nanoparticles, particles measured in billionths of a meter, have particularly strong antimicrobial properties due to their large surface area relative to their mass. These nanoparticles can be incorporated into wound dressings, coatings for medical devices, textiles, and various other products. The quantities required are tiny, but the potential applications are numerous, and as global healthcare improves and demand for medical products grows, silver's role in medical applications may expand accordingly. Water purification represents another potential growth area for silver use. Access to clean drinking water remains a challenge in many parts of the world, and silver's ability to kill bacteria and prevent microbial growth makes it useful in water treatment applications. Silver-impregnated filters, silver ions added to water systems, silver coatings on storage containers, these and other approaches exploit the metal's antimicrobial properties to help ensure water safety. The quantities of silver required for such applications are generally modest, but the cumulative demand from billions of people needing clean water could prove significant. Space exploration and satellite technology find uses for silver in various demanding applications. The vacuum of space, the extreme temperatures, the radiation environment, all create challenges that require materials with exceptional properties. Silver's thermal conductivity helps manage heat in spacecraft electronics. Its electrical conductivity serves in critical circuits where reliability is essential. Its reflectivity protects spacecraft from solar radiation. As humanity expands its presence in space, as satellite constellations proliferate, and as missions venture to the Moon and Mars, the specialized uses for silver in these demanding environments may grow. The development of silver-backed digital tokens represents an interesting modern evolution of silver's monetary legacy. Several blockchain-based projects have created digital tokens that represent ownership of physical silver held in vaults. These tokens can be transferred electronically, traded on digital exchanges, and used in various ways that physical silver cannot, while theoretically maintaining their connection to the underlying metal. The concept is not fundamentally different from the silver certificates of earlier centuries, paper representing silver held elsewhere, but the technology and the global reach of digital systems create new possibilities. Whether these silver-backed tokens will achieve significant adoption remains to be seen, but they represent one way that silver's traditional role as a store of value might adapt to digital economies. The environmental implications of silver mining and use are increasingly relevant in an era of heightened environmental consciousness. Mining operations, wherever they occur, affect the landscape and local ecosystems. Open-pit mines remove overburden and create vast excavations. Underground mines generate tailings and waste rock that must be managed to prevent contamination of water supplies. Smelting and refining operations consume energy and can produce air and water pollution if not properly controlled. Modern mining operations in developed countries typically face strict environmental regulations, but these regulations add costs and complexity to production. The use of silver in products also has environmental dimensions. Silver in electronics contributes to the growing challenge of electronic waste, or e-waste, which contains a complex mixture of materials that can be valuable if recovered but problematic if simply discarded. Improving the collection and recycling of e-waste to recover silver and other metals is both an environmental necessity and an economic opportunity. Silver's antimicrobial properties, while beneficial in medical and hygiene applications, raise questions about the environmental effects of silver nanoparticles as they enter wastewater streams and eventually natural water bodies. Research into these effects is ongoing, balancing the benefits of silver's antimicrobial uses against potential ecological impacts. The question of silver's future value is ultimately unanswerable with precision, dependent as it is on countless factors from technological developments to economic conditions to geopolitical events. But certain patterns seem likely to continue. Industrial demand will probably remain substantial, supported by silver's unique properties and its utility in technologies that address pressing human needs. Solar power, electric vehicles, advanced electronics, medical applications, these and other uses create a baseline demand that is unlikely to disappear. Investment demand will fluctuate with economic conditions and investor sentiment, rising when uncertainty drives people toward tangible assets, and falling when confidence in paper investments returns. Silver's abundance relative to gold suggests that it should be cheaper, and it is. But silver's industrial uses create a demand profile quite different from gold's, and this difference helps explain why silver behaves differently in markets. Gold is primarily a monetary metal, held for its stability and its history as the ultimate store of value. Silver straddles the line between industrial commodity and monetary metal, responding to both industrial demand cycles and the same concerns about currency and financial stability that drive gold investment. This dual nature makes silver's price more volatile than gold's, more responsive to economic conditions, more prone to periods of dramatic movement in either direction. For someone considering silver as an investment or as a store of value, the lessons of history might offer guidance. Silver has maintained value across millennia, but that value has fluctuated substantially over shorter periods. Those who bought silver near its peaks in 1980 or 2011 and expected to sell quickly at a profit were disappointed. Those who held silver through multiple cycles, accepting volatility as part of the bargain, generally found that the metal retained purchasing power over the long term. Silver is not a path to quick riches, but rather a patient store of value, requiring a long-term perspective and a tolerance for fluctuation. The metal itself, of course, remains indifferent to all of this human activity and concern. The silver atoms arranged in their crystalline structure, reflecting light with their characteristic luster, conducting electricity and heat with unmatched efficiency, slowly releasing ions that disrupt bacterial cells. These properties emerge from the fundamental laws of physics and chemistry, from the particular configuration of protons, neutrons, and electrons that make silver what it is. Humans discovered these properties and found uses for them, assigned value to the metal, and incorporated it into economic and monetary systems, fought over it and speculated in it and treasured it. But the silver itself simply is a piece of the physical world that humans have learned to recognize, extract, refine, and use for their own purposes. As you think about silver, perhaps you can appreciate both its practical utility and its deeper symbolic significance. It is a metal that has served humanity for thousands of years, that connects ancient civilizations to modern technologies, that bridges the physical world of atoms and properties with the abstract world of value and exchange. It has been coins in a Roman soldier's purse, bars in a Spanish treasure fleet, certificates in a farmer's hand, circuits in a smartphone, contacts in a solar panel. Through all these forms and uses, silver has persisted, adapting to changing human needs while maintaining its essential nature, a testament to the enduring relationship between humans and the physical substances of which our world is made. Perhaps you can return now to that piece of silver you might have nearby, or simply imagine one resting in your palm. It feels different now, doesn't it? Weighted with the knowledge of all the hands that have held such metal before yours, all the purposes it has served, all the journeys it has made across oceans and centuries. You are connected through this simple element to miners in ancient Anatolia, to merchants on the Silk Road, to farmers debating currency in Kansas, to engineers designing solar panels for a warming world. Silver has been patient through all of it, adapting quietly to whatever humans needed, serving as money when money was needed, as medicine when healing was needed, as technology when progress was needed. It has witnessed empires rise and fall, has travelled from mountain depths to distant shores, has passed through countless hands in countless forms, and through it all has remained itself, that cool, lustrous metal that catches light just so. You are part of this story too, part of the long human endeavour to understand and use and value the world around us. The story continues, as it always has, flowing forward like a gentle stream. But for now, you can rest. You can let the silver rest. You can let everything settle, soft as moonlight on still water, and simply drift away into quiet sleep.